While the nation focuses on the crisis at the border, pressure on President Trump's former fixer has been mounting. This week, we saw reports that Michael Cohen is considering flipping, and we learned he wants the president to foot the bill for his legal fees. Cohen also quit the RNC and openly criticized Trump's immigration policy, and now we're learning new details about Trump's cozy relationship with the National Enquirer. The Washington Post reporting the tabloid sent stories about Trump to Cohen for approval before they went to print. And then there was this photo posted on Twitter. Cohen seen smiling with Trump's celebrity enemy, Tom Arnold, who was working on a new show focused on obtaining damaging Trump tapes. Arnold further fueled speculation tonight that Cohen may be working against his former boss.
I'm going to spend the weekend with Michael Cohen. And the president, Donald Trump, Ivanka Trump, I'm spending the weekend hanging out with Michael Cohen. And there's a lot going on.
Did Michael Cohen tell you specifically, really just yes or no, that he is cooperating with the authorities, should charges be brought? Did he tell you? Do you not want to answer the question?
No.
You don't want to answer the question?
Right.
Cohen then downplayed Arnold's claims on Twitter tonight, writing, quote, "This was a chance public encounter in the hotel lobby where he asked for a selfie. Not spending the weekend together, did not discuss being on his show, nor did we discuss POTUS." Hashtag done, hashtag ridiculous. But just in this last hour on this network, Tom Arnold was back at it, discussing Cohen and his alleged cooperation in an interview with Lawrence O'Donnell on The Last Word.
Michael Cohen is cooperating on the right side of this right now.
So, in the right side, does that include the FBI and the prosecutors?
Yes.
So he's cooperating with them already?
Yes.
Okay.
100%.
And how do you know that? He told you that?
He didn't say those words, but I know that.
He said? What were the words he said?
I know people are...
That indicate that. No, that's okay. I can understand.
I'm with you. You know that.
Cohen is under federal investigation in connection with a $130,000 payment of hush money to porn star Stormy Daniels. Her attorney weighed in on this network earlier today.
Perhaps this is a flare gun shot in the air for Michael Cohen to, a message to Mr. Trump or others that there may be things coming down the pike. There is no doubt in my mind that Michael Cohen is going to be indicted and face some very, very serious charges. There's no doubt in my mind that he's going to try to trade or flip on this.
Here with us tonight, Mimi Rocah, former assistant U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York, now a distinguished fellow in criminal justice at the Pace University School of Law and an MSNBC legal analyst, and Josh Gerstein, senior White House reporter for Politico. And questions I didn't think I'd be asking on a 11 o'clock news show on MSNBC a couple years ago. But let's talk about Tom Arnold.
Let's.
He's hinting at an awful lot. In the interview on this network earlier tonight on CNN, we played clips hinting in that clip we showed, hinting in other parts of that interview. His antics that we played seemed erratic. The incentive he has to hype interest in this special he's got coming out seems obvious. I am a layman legally. I'm curious, watching that interview tonight, watching these interviews, what did you make of it?
Look, it's hard to know what he didn't actually come out and say it, right? So even when he was asked, is he cooperating by Lawrence, Arnold said, yeah, he's on the right side. But then when he asked about the exact words, the words were about, I'm with you. Cohen saying to Arnold, I'm with you, which doesn't say anything about what he's doing with the government.
Right.
But it doesn't answer the question that Lawrence had asked, which is he cooperating with the government, right? So, there's a lot of sort of, it's good TV. There's a lot of different things that Arnold has said. One thing I know for sure, and this is not the point of what he's saying, but I know for sure that Cohen's new lawyer, Guy Petrillo, and the prosecutors and the FBI do not want Tom Arnold out there doing what he's doing right now, okay? Because if Michael Cohen is headed in the direction of cooperating with them, they don't want Tom Arnold talking about what Cohen is also telling them out on television, and they don't want Cohen then on Twitter saying, no, that's not true, and Arnold saying, no, what you're saying isn't true, it's hurting. It can potentially hurt the credibility of what may be a very important witness if you start getting into this Twitter fest about what someone did or didn't say and what someone is or isn't doing. Cooperation is meant to be a confidential process, even if someone isn't cooperating proactively. So I know at least Cohen's attorney is probably counseling Cohen to not do this, especially given the attorney that he now has, Guy Petrillo, former prosecutor. I know him, a very honorable, good lawyer, upstanding person, well thought of, well respected. He would not, I don't think, be in favor of this. So, it's hard to know what to make of Arnold saying all of this. I think all that said, though, Cohen has a lot of incentive to cooperate. And so I don't think it's beyond the realm at all that he is at least headed in that direction. Cooperation right now wouldn't mean, obviously, that he's going in court tomorrow or anytime soon and pleading guilty. It may mean that he's already, possibly, I don't know this, started talking, with them informally or formally, or it may just mean that that's where he's headed. That's the direction he's going in, and that makes sense because now, remember, the judge has now basically adopted the special master's findings, which say that almost nothing is privileged. So all of that evidence that was seized is coming in, and so. Against Cohen. And so that evidence and we're just starting to hear about more and more crimes that they're obviously looking at, and I'm sure there's more to come. So he's under a lot of pressure to cooperate.
And Josh, I mean, I'm just curious, as somebody who knows what you're talking about when it comes to this story and watched what Tom Arnold had to say, where does your interpretation fall on that scale of, kind of hype or something erratic on one side versus something real on the other side? How do you, where's the balance for you?
Well, I do think that what Tom Arnold was saying in these several interviews has to be taken with more than a grain of salt, probably with at least a full tablespoon or more. But there is this element here where you do get the sense that Michael Cohen is sometimes trolling President Trump, that he could have taken the opportunity not to have a selfie taken with Arnold, but he went ahead and did it. And in some of these comments and interactions seems kind of playful. It does seem like there's a degree of attention seeking with respect to the president, like there's some kind of deep-seated psychological grievance or neediness there. Whether that's part of a legal strategy or some other kind of psychological issue is hard to say. The last time I checked in with people close to Cohen, the word was that he was not cooperating with federal prosecutors, that he was open to talking with them about it, but that those discussions had not progressed to the point that anybody could describe as actively cooperating.
And I think there was one point in that interview tonight when Arnold said something to the effect, paraphrasing here, of, hey, I'm overselling this interaction with Cohen a little bit, but he's underselling it. He's very much underselling. Cohen is very much underselling it. So I think Arnold had said something to that effect at one point. Josh, though, related to the issue of Michael Cohen, then in the legal situation he finds himself in, there were also some court filings, or there was a court filing today that shed a little bit more light on the documents the government now has in its possession. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I think Mimi was alluding to it just a moment ago, but it talked about the judge and the special master's decision on how much information is privileged here. And what was fascinating in this order that Judge Wood put out was that even among the relatively small universe of information they decided was privileged, the vast majority of it seemed to have nothing to do with either President Trump or the Trump Organization or any other clients, like folks like Sean Hannity, for example. The stuff that was deemed privileged seems to be legal advice that Michael Cohen was getting from other lawyers about Michael Cohen's personal exposure or other legal matters, and very, very little of it has to do with any clients. So the total amount that's going to be withheld from prosecutors that could potentially be relevant to President Trump is an infinitesimal fraction, probably on the order of a 1/10 of 1% or 100th of 1% of the material that's been processed so far.
And Mimi, any sense on the timetable in this? All the speculation, like you say, is about, is there going to be some kind of deal, some kind of cooperation, some kind of flipping? Is that just we find out when we find out, or are there any clues that we can kind of discern here when we get an answer to that?
Well, we find out when they want us to find out. I mean, even once he goes down that road, if he goes down the road of cooperation, we may not know it. Now, Michael Cohen is unusual because he clearly does like the attention and wants to talk. They won't want him to confirm to anyone if he is cooperating, they being the government. And his lawyer, I'm sure, would try to tell him not to, but I don't know if he can help himself. But, you know, the truth is, a sign might be, I expect Michael Cohen to get charged, right? Now that this discovery process is coming to an end, one would think that the next step would be him getting charged. If for some reason charges aren't filed, that would be a sign to me that there are discussions going on. Now, it doesn't have to be cooperation. They could be discussions about a plea without cooperating, right? Like he hired Guy Petrillo. You know, hiring an alum from the office is someone who can help him navigate the office. Whether you go down the cooperation road, meaning giving information in exchange for something, you know, which you get from the government, it's called a 5K letter, or just negotiating a plea agreement that's favorable to him so that he can, you know, try to spend less time in jail than he otherwise would if he went to trial. So he has the same options available to him that any defendant has once he's charged. And even if he's not charged, you can start that negotiation process. So if those charges aren't filed relatively soon, that would be a sign that he's trying to negotiate something. Again, I think we have to be careful about, you know, assuming we know what that something is yet.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.